Imagine the morning. Hawaii, December 7th, 1941, 7:53 a.m., Sunday. On the deck of the battleship, Nevada, the band is playing. They are preparing to raise the flag. In the mess halls on shore, bacon is frying, coffee is brewing. Most sailors are still asleep or lazily stretching in their bunks, planning their shore leave on the beach. It was paradise. The final minutes of paradise. The sound appeared first as a low hum, like a swarm of angry bees. A second later, it turned into a roar. An officer on the Nevada looks up at the sky and sees the silhouette of a plane. It's low. Too low. The officer sees something detach from the fuselage. A splash in the water. A dull thud. And then the world explodes. In the next 90 minutes, paradise turns into hell. The water in the harbor is burning. Oil, leaking from ruptured tanks, turns the ocean into black, sticky fire. The battleship Arizona lifts out of the water and cracks in half. 1,177 men die instantly. Bombs and torpedoes rain down from the sky. The Japanese pilots operate like surgeons. Precise, cold-blooded, lethal. By 10 a.m., it is all over. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, the pride of the nation, lies on the bottom or is burning. 8 battleships are taken out of action. More than 2,400 Americans are dead. At that exact moment, 6,000 kilometers away from the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor, corks are popping in Tokyo. In the Japanese General Staff, euphoria reigns. For them, this is not a tragedy. For them, this is the perfect chess game, a grandmaster's move. Admirals congratulate each other. They did the impossible. They knocked out the richest country in the world with a single punch, before it even had time to put on its gloves. The War March plays on the radio in Japan. People weep with happiness in the streets. It seems to them that the war is already won. America is humiliated. America is weak. America will not dare to respond. Or so they thought. But while the Japanese generals celebrated, the smoke over Pearl Harbor began to clear. And through that smoke, a truth emerged that Tokyo chose not to see. A truth that would cost them their empire. Look at the harbor closely. Yes, the Arizona and Oklahoma are destroyed. The battleships are burning. But something is missing. The main target of the Japanese attack was not there. The aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out at sea that morning. They survived. Look at the shore. Huge oil storage tanks, the black blood of the fleet, are intact. The Japanese pilots flew right past them. The dry docks, where any ship can be repaired, are untouched. Japan punched America in the face, broke its nose, knocked out its teeth, but it did not touch the heart. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this attack, allegedly said a phrase that became legend. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Even if he didn't say those exact words, he certainly thought them. The Japanese command made a fatal error. They judged America by themselves. They thought the loss of the fleet would force Americans to the negotiating table. That a democratic society, softened by comfort, would not want to die for distant islands. They didn't understand one thing. Instead of fear, they sowed rage. In Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in Chicago, the factory sirens were already starting to wail. The giant had woken up, and he was very angry. But to understand how Japan decided on such an insane step in the first place, we need to rewind the tape. We need to understand why. On December 7th, 1941, Japan simply had no choice left. To understand the madness of 1941, you need to realize one simple thing. Japan did not want war with the United States. Japan feared the United States. Japanese diplomats knew English. Their admirals drank whiskey. Their engineers copied American machines. They perfectly understood that an industrial monster lived on the other side of the Pacific. But Japan had a problem, and that problem was in China. Since 1937, the empire had been fighting a brutal, bloody war on the continent. They called it expanding living space. The rest of the world called it a slaughter. The Japanese army was bogged down. China turned out to be a massive swamp that swallowed soldiers, bullets, and equipment. But most of all, this swamp demanded oil. And here begins the cruelest irony of this story. The tanks that crushed Chinese villages, the planes that bombed Shanghai, the battleships that blockaded the coast, all of them ran on American oil. By 1940, Japan was buying 80% of its oil from the US. 80%. Imagine you are in a fight to the death, but the air for your lungs is being sold to you by your opponent. President Roosevelt saw this. American society was boiling with outrage, reading newspapers about Japanese atrocities in Nanjing. But Roosevelt hesitated. He feared that if he turned off the tap, Japan would snap. In the summer of 1941, Japan took a fatal step. It occupied French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam. This was a staging ground for a push south. Washington's patience snapped. On July 26, 1941, Roosevelt signs an executive order. He doesn't send aircraft carriers. He doesn't drop bombs. He simply takes a pen and freezes Japanese assets in American banks. The effect was instantaneous. Trade stopped. The oil tap was screwed shut tight. The British and the Dutch immediately joined the embargo. For Tokyo, this wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. This was the sound of a lock clicking shut on a gas chamber door. At that moment, panic reigned in the Imperial Navy headquarters. The admirals took out their calculators. The numbers were terrifying. The country's oil reserves would last for a year and a half. If active combat operations were undertaken, 1 year. Every day the fleet sat idle. It burned tons of precious fuel. The clock started ticking, loudly, relentlessly. It was the mathematics of the apocalypse. Imagine yourself in the place of the Japanese Prime Minister. 2 documents lie before you. Option A, surrender. Leave China as the Americans demand. This would mean admitting that thousands of dead soldiers died for nothing. It would mean national disgrace, the collapse of the army, and most likely, civil war or a coup. Samurai do not retreat. Option B, find oil yourselves. There was oil, a lot of oil, in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. But to get to it, the Japanese fleet had to pass the Philippines, and the Philippines were American territory back then. U.S. bases were there. Japanese strategists reasoned coldly. We cannot seize oil in the south while leaving the American fleet in the Philippines at our rear. They will cut our supply lines in a week. The circle closed. To survive, Japan needed oil. To take the oil, they needed to capture Indonesia. To capture Indonesia, they needed to secure their flanks. To secure their flanks, they needed to destroy the American fleet. This decision was not dictated by hatred or ideology. It was the decision of a rat cornered in a trap. In the autumn of 1941, while diplomats were still smiling at each other in Washington, the war machine was already rolling downhill. The decision was made. But how? How can a country the size of California hope to defeat a country occupying an entire continent? They had no chance in a fair fight. They needed a miracle worker, a man who would come up with a way to cheat reality itself. And they had such a man. Although, ironically, he was the only one begging them not to do it. The man who had to pull the trigger was named Isoroku Yamamoto. If you picture a fanatical samurai waving a sword and screaming about the divine wind, forget that image. Yamamoto was different. He loved whiskey, adored poker, and could play shogi all night long. But most importantly, he knew America. In the 1920s, he studied at Harvard, He served as a naval attaché in Washington. He hitchhiked across the states. While his colleagues in Tokyo studied maps of the Pacific, Yamamoto studied American factories. He saw the smoking chimneys of Detroit. He saw the endless oil fields of Texas. He saw a nation that could build a skyscraper in a year and a car in an hour. Upon returning to Japan, he became the voice of reason in a room full of madmen. When army generals shouted that the American spirit was weak and would not withstand a blow, Yamamoto grimly shook his head. He spoke plainly. To enter into a war with the U.S. is like fighting the whole world. But Yamamoto's tragedy was that he was a soldier, and when the emperor gave the order, duty forced him to silence his doubts. He was given a task: devise a plan to defeat a country that, as he knew, was impossible to defeat. And then, the poker player inside the admiral went all in. Old Japanese strategy assumed luring the American fleet to Japanese shores and destroying it in one decisive battle. Yamamoto threw that plan in the trash. He understood. If America was given time to mobilize, it would crush Japan with sheer weight. The only chance was to strike first. To strike so hard that America would fall to its knees from pain and shock. In a private conversation with the Prime Minister, Yamamoto uttered his famous prophecy, words that make your blood run cold if you know what happened next. He said, "If you order me to start a war, I shall run wild for the first 6 months. I will show you an uninterrupted succession of victories. But if the war drags on for 2 or 3 years, I have absolutely no confidence in what will happen." 6 months. That was his ultimatum. That was the lifespan of the Japanese Empire. Yamamoto's plan did not involve capturing Washington or landing in California. That was physically impossible. The plan was psychological. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be a knockout in the first round. The calculation was that American society, seeing burning battleships and thousands of coffins, would demand peace. That the soft Yankees would decide that Asia was not worth such sacrifices. Yamamoto hoped that the U.S. would agree to negotiations, leave China and the oil to Japan, and go away to lick its wounds. It was a desperate bet. A bluff by a player holding a pair of deuces, but staring into the eyes of an opponent with 4 aces. Yamamoto prepared the attack, but deep down he prayed that the diplomats would reach an agreement. A map hung in his cabin on the flagship, and every morning he looked at it, understanding that his fleet was not sailing to victory. It was sailing to wake a beast that would eventually devour them all. But the order was given. On November 26, 1941, the strike force left the Kuril Islands. 6 aircraft carriers, 400 planes. They sailed in total radio silence through the northern Pacific, where storms hid them from sight. The die was cast, but even the genius Yamamoto made a mistake. He planned the perfect murder of battleships, but he overlooked what really mattered in modern warfare. And that mistake became obvious just 30 minutes after the attack began. When the smoke over Oahu began to clear, the Japanese pilots returned to their carriers as heroes. They reported incredible success. Battleship Row destroyed. The American fleet paralyzed. It seemed Yamamoto's plan had worked perfectly. But a few days later, a new commander of the Pacific Fleet arrived in Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz. He walked through the ruins of Pearl Harbor. He saw the twisted metal sticking out of the water and the bodies still being pulled from the bay. It was a heartbreaking sight. But then Nimitz looked up and looked at what had survived. And, as historians say, at that moment he realized Japan had just lost the war. In the heat of the attack, the Japanese made 3 critical mistakes. 3 misses that turned their tactical victory into a strategic defeat. Mistake number 1, the aircraft carriers. It was pure luck. Divine intervention, if you will. That Sunday, there was not a single American carrier in the harbor. The Enterprise and Lexington were delivering planes to remote islands. The Saratoga was under repair in California. The Japanese sank the battleships, the kings of the past war, but they didn't touch the carriers, the kings of the future war. The main striking force of the U.S. Navy remained intact. Mistake number 2. The dry docks. Japanese bombs obliterated ships, but barely touched the repair shops. This sounds boring, but it is critically important. Thanks to the surviving docks, most of the sunken or damaged ships didn't have to be towed across the ocean to California. They were raised, patched up, and returned to service right there in Hawaii. Of the 8 damaged battleships, 6 returned to service and took part in the destruction of Japan. They rose from the dead because the Japanese didn't bomb the hospital. But there was a third mistake, the most fatal one: the oil. Around Pearl Harbor, right under the open sky, stood giant fuel tanks. They held 4.5 million barrels of oil. This was the lifeblood of the Pacific Fleet. These tanks were sitting ducks, huge, black, stationary, a few incendiary bullets, and Hawaii would have turned into a blazing torch that would be impossible to extinguish. Admiral Nimitz later said plainly, had the Japanese destroyed the oil, the war would have been prolonged for another 2 years. Without fuel, the American fleet would have been forced to retreat to the U.S. West Coast. Hawaii would become useless. Pearl Harbor would cease to be a forward base. Why didn't the Japanese do it? Here the human factor comes into play. The commander of the attack force, Admiral Nagumo, was a cautious man. After 2 waves of attacks, his pilots, led by the legendary Mitsuo Fuchida, begged for permission for a 3rd wave. They screamed, "Let us finish them off! Let us burn the docks and the oil! Let's find the carriers!" But Nagumo hesitated. He knew that American defenses had woken up. Anti-aircraft fire was dense. He didn't know where the American carriers were. Maybe they were already flanking him. Nagumo decided that a bird in the hand was worth 2 in the bush. He had already won a great victory. Why risk the fleet for tanks of sludge? At 1:30 p.m., he gave the order to turn around and go home. This was the decision that saved America. Japan smashed the shop window, but didn't rob the store. They angered the giant, but left him his sword, his shield, and most importantly, the gasoline to get to the battlefield. In Tokyo, they continued to celebrate. They counted sunken battleships and counted victories that hadn't happened yet. They didn't understand what had actually happened in America. They thought they had broken the nation's spirit. In reality, they had simply pressed the start button on the most powerful industrial machine in human history, and that machine was already starting to rev up. While ships were burning out in the Pacific, an event occurred in Detroit that went unnoticed by Japanese intelligence. In February 1942, the last civilian car rolled off the Ford assembly line, a gray sedan. Someone had written on its windshield, "For victory." After that, production stopped. But not for long. America did something no other country in the world could do. It took the planet's most powerful economy and flipped the switch to war. Toaster manufacturers started making shell casings. Underwear factories switched to sewing camouflage nets. Refrigerator manufacturers started assembling machine gun parts. But the symbol of this power was the Willow Run plant in Michigan. Japanese engineers were proud of their Zero fighter. It was a beautiful machine, hand-assembled by the best craftsmen. Every rivet was perfectly fitted. It was art. Americans answered art with the assembly line. At the Willow Run plant, the conveyor belt stretched for 1.5 miles. Raw materials entered at the gates. At the end, a heavy B-24 Liberator bomber rolled out. Do you know how fast? At peak production, the factory turned out one 4-engine bomber every hour, every 60 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. While a Japanese master spent days polishing a single part, Henry Ford stamped them out by the thousands. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers are what won this war. In 1941, steel production, USA, 75 million tons. Japan, 7 million. a gap of more than 10 times. It's as if a heavyweight champion stepped into the ring against a first grader. But the scariest thing wasn't even the steel. It was the people. Japan sent its men to the front. Their jobs remained empty. Women in Japan were barely allowed near the machines. Tradition did not permit it. America did otherwise. Millions of men went to fight. Fine. Their wives, sisters, and mothers took their places. Rosie the Riveter became more than just a poster. It was reality. Grandmothers, yesterday's housewives, high school students, everyone stood at the machines. By 1944, American shipyards were launching a new warship every single day. Think about that. A new ship every day. Japan could sink 3 destroyers in a battle. It would be a great victory for the Imperial Navy. But the next week, 5 new destroyers would leave San Diego. It was a war of attrition taken to the absolute extreme. In 1944, the U.S. produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan barely scraped together $28,000, and with great difficulty, losing quality. Yamamoto knew this. He had seen these factories with his own eyes. Remember his words about 6 months? The timer he started at Pearl Harbor was ticking down the final seconds. The American industrial machine had accelerated. The giant hadn't just woken up. He had put on brass knuckles the size of a continent. But the Japanese command was still living in illusions. In the spring of 1942, they looked at the map and saw only their victories. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines captured, Java occupied. They thought they had outsmarted history. They thought the American factories simply wouldn't be fast enough. And in a sense, for the first 6 months, they were right. It was the time of Japanese triumph, a time when it seemed the sun would never set on the new empire. Yamamoto promised the emperor 6 months of victory, and, credit where credit is due, he kept his word. Historians call the period from December 41 to May 42 the Japanese Blitzkrieg. But even that word doesn't convey the scale. Imagine a map of the Pacific. Now, imagine someone knocked over a can of red paint onto it. The stains spread with frightening speed. In the same hours that bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, Thailand, Wake Island, and Guam. They hit everywhere at once. The world was in shock. Western generals had insisted for years that the Japanese army was a second-rate force, that their pilots were nearsighted, and their equipment was a pathetic copy of European designs. Reality hit them in the face with the butt of an Arisaka rifle. In Malaya, the Japanese did the impossible. The British expected an attack from the sea, pointing their guns at the ocean. The Japanese emerged from the impenetrable jungles behind them. They moved on bicycles. Thousands of soldiers on simple bicycles, without heavy equipment, rode where tanks got stuck. On February 15, 1942, Singapore fell. The Gibraltar of the East, an impregnable fortress, 130,000 British, Australian, and Indian soldiers surrendered to 30,000 Japanese. It was the largest capitulation in British military history. Churchill called it the worst disaster. But for Americans, the most painful blow was the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur was there. Thousands of American boys were there. They fought bravely. They held out on the Bataan Peninsula for months, eating mule and monkey meat, suffering from malaria. But there was no help coming. The fleet lay on the bottom at Pearl Harbor. When the garrison on the island of Corregidor finally raised the white flag, Japan gained total control over the region. The plan was working. Borneo oil, seized. Malayan rubber, seized. Tin, seized. The Japanese Empire created a massive defensive perimeter. They built a wall of island fortresses in the middle of the ocean. In Tokyo, an atmosphere of absolute superiority reigned. Newspapers screamed about the invincible spirit of Yamato. The military even coined a term for this condition: senshobyo, victory disease. This is when you get so used to winning that you stop assessing risks. You start believing in your own divinity. Japanese admirals looked at the Americans with contempt. They saw footage of the surrender in the Philippines. They saw weak Western men raising their hands. They thought, America won't want to pay this price. They are merchants, not warriors. Soon they will crawl to ask for peace. It was a fatal psychological error. They didn't understand that the Bataan Death March, when American prisoners were driven through the heat without water and stragglers were bayoneted, did not frighten the U.S. It filled them with a cold, calculating hatred. Posters saying, "Remember Pearl Harbor," were replaced by, "Remember Bataan." America wasn't going to negotiate. America was going to kill. And while the Japanese celebrated, dividing trophies and planning the invasion of Australia, the calendar turned a page. June 1942 arrived. The 6 months promised by Yamamoto had expired. To the day, the magic was over. Yamamoto understood that time was working against him. He needed one more victory, a final period. He needed to lure out the surviving American carriers and sink them once and for all. He chose a tiny atoll in the middle of the ocean for this, a place called Midway. He thought he was setting a trap for the Americans. He didn't know that American intelligence was already reading his mail. Yamamoto set the trap. He sent a massive fleet to Midway Atoll to force the American carriers to leave Pearl Harbor to defend the scrap of land. The plan was perfect, with one exception. In a damp basement in Hawaii, a group of American cryptographers, led by Joseph Rochefort, was doing the impossible. They worked 20 hours a day, fueled by coffee and cigarettes, trying to break the Japanese naval code JN-25. They were reading Japanese radio messages. They knew a strike would hit target AF. But where was that? Rochefort pulled a trick. He ordered the Midway garrison to send an uncoded message. "We have a broken water distillation plant." A few hours later, Japanese intelligence transmitted to Tokyo, "Target AF has fresh water problems." Bingo. Admiral Nimitz now knew not only where, but when. Instead of walking into a trap, the American fleet set an ambush of its own. The morning of June 4th, 1942, Japanese pilots bomb the island. They are sure the American fleet is nowhere nearby. Admiral Nagumo orders planes on the decks to be rearmed for a second strike on the ground. Bombs are taken off. Torpedoes put away. The decks are cluttered with fuel hoses and ammunition. It is the most vulnerable moment. And then, the Americans appear on the horizon. At first, it looked like a disaster for the U.S. American torpedo bombers, old and slow, attacked without fighter cover. It was suicide. Japanese Zeros dove down and shot them like clay pigeons. Of the 15 planes in one squadron, not one returned. The Japanese gunners cheered. It seemed the attack was repelled. The sky was clear. But the sacrifice of the American torpedo bombers was not in vain. They forced the Japanese fighters to descend to the water level. The sky above the Japanese fleet was left empty. And at exactly 10:22 a.m., American Dauntless dive bombers broke through the clouds. No one expected them. The Japanese had no radar to spot them in time. And the Zeros were down below, near the water, and couldn't climb fast enough. These were the famous 5 minutes of fate. The American pilots saw the decks of the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, below them. Dozens of planes stood on the decks, fully fueled and loaded with bombs. These weren't ships. These were floating powder kegs. The Americans went into a dive. The first bomb punched through the flight deck of the Akagi and exploded in the hangar. Detonating fuel and ammo turned the flagship into a hellish inferno in seconds. Almost simultaneously, explosions rocked the Kaga and Soryu. At 10:20 a.m., Japan had 4 heavy carriers and control of the Pacific. At 10:25 a.m., 3 of them were burning ruins. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, managed to launch a counterstrike and damage the American Yorktown, but by evening it too went to the bottom. The score was 4-1 for the US, but the numbers of lost ships are not the worst thing for Tokyo. Ships can be rebuilt, although Japan couldn't do it quickly. The most terrible loss was the people. With those 4 ships, hundreds of the Empire's best pilots went to the bottom. The veterans who had trained for years, the ones who bombed Pearl Harbor, and hundreds of mechanics and technicians died, the elite of the fleet, men who knew every screw in the planes. Japan lost its gold reserve. After Midway, the Japanese fleet shifted to defense forever. The dream of a quick victory, which Yamamoto spoke of, drowned along with the carrier Akagi. 6 months had passed. The prophecy came true. Now began the long war that Yamamoto feared more than death. A war where quality no longer mattered. Only quantity mattered. And in this new war, Japan had a problem that could not be solved by samurai spirit or tactics. The problem was how they taught their soldiers to die, instead of teaching them to win. After Midway, the war changed. It stopped being a competition of tactics. It became a competition of systems, and the American system proved to be head and shoulders above. Look at how the sides treated their pilots. The secret to victory lies there. In Japan, the best pilot is a modern samurai. He must fight at the front until the end. If he survived 10 battles, he is sent into the 11th. His experience, his knowledge, his instincts died with him when his 0 was finally shot down. America did otherwise. As soon as an American pilot racked up a certain number of victories or combat missions, he was pulled from the front. He was sent home. Why? To drink beer and sell war bonds? No. He was sent to flight schools, to Pensacola, to Florida. There, he taught cadets. He told the rookies, "This is how I shot down a Japanese plane. This is how he moves. This is how you escape an attack." Experience accumulated. American rookies in 1943 knew more about war than Japanese veterans. By 1944, the gap became catastrophic. The average flight time of an American cadet before being sent to the front was over 500 hours. He knew how to fly blind. He knew navigation. He felt the machine. The average flight time of a Japanese pilot in the same year dropped to 40 hours. 40 hours! That was barely enough to learn how to take off and keep formation. Aerial combat was out of the question. The Japanese command sent children into the sky who couldn't even land properly. They were up against professional killers in the newest Hellcats, which were faster, more powerful, and better armored than the paper-thin Zeros. The result was predictable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 received a cynical but accurate name from American sailors: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The U.S. lost 29 planes. Japan lost nearly 400. American pilots returned to their carriers complaining only that they had run out of ammo. There were too many turkeys. And this wasn't just in the sky. The same thing was happening at sea. American submarines, operating in wolf packs, severed the Empire's arteries. By 1944, oil simply stopped arriving in Japan. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be built. It reached the point of absurdity. The Japanese fleet, the massive battleships, Yamato and Musashi, sat in ports on islands for months because they had no fuel to get to Japan, and Japan had no fuel to send planes to cover them. The Empire was starving to death. But even then, they didn't surrender, and that is what frightened the Americans most of all. Logic said, "You lost. Surrender." Japanese logic answered, "We will take you with us." The era of the kamikaze began. If you can't teach a pilot to fight, teach him to crash into a ship. It was a weapon of desperation. America watched this with horror. How do you fight an enemy for whom death is the goal? The answer came from that same industrial giant. In 1945, the U.S. fleet was so massive that kamikazes were like mosquito bites to an elephant. Painful, bloody, but not fatal. An armada, the likes of which the world had never seen, approached the shores of Japan. Dozens of carriers, hundreds of destroyers, thousands of planes blocking out the sun. Yamamoto's math worked down to the last decimal point. He said he couldn't beat America in a long war. He was wrong about only one thing. He didn't live to see how crushing that defeat would be. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted the bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto. They knew his route thanks to those same broken codes. The architect of Pearl Harbor died in the jungle. But the war machine he started continued to grind up millions of people for another 2 years. And now, we only need to summarize. Why? Why did smart people in Tokyo commit this suicide? So how did they think they could win? Looking back from 2025, Japan's decision seems like suicide. How could a country with a GDP 10 times smaller than America's challenge the giant? The answer is simple and terrifying. They didn't plan to defeat America in the sense we understand it. They didn't intend to see a Japanese flag over the White House. They didn't intend to occupy California. Their plan was built on one fundamental mistake. They believed that America was a nation of merchants, a nation of individualists, caring only about their own comfort. Japanese strategists believed that democracy makes a nation soft, that disagreements in Congress, a free press, and arguments in kitchens mean weakness of spirit. They thought, we are ready to die for the emperor, but Americans aren't ready to die for cheap gas and a map of the world. It seemed to them that if they hit hard enough, the sleeping giant would roll over and go back to sleep. They were wrong. They mistook debate for division. They mistook the love of comfort for cowardice. They mistook democracy for weakness. Pearl Harbor didn't split America. It fused it together. The moment the first bomb hit the Arizona, all internal arguments vanished. Isolationists fell silent. Workers forgot about strikes. The nation became a monolith. Japan didn't lose the war in 1945, when mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It lost it on December 7th, 1941. On the very day they decided that the spirit of Yamato could break the laws of physics and economics. History loves symbolism. On September 2nd, 1945, World War II officially ended. The surrender ceremony took place in Tokyo Bay, but not on Japanese soil. It took place on the deck of the American battleship Missouri. It was a huge ship, a steel leviathan, one of dozens just like it built in American shipyards during the war. The Japanese delegation, in top hats and tailcoats, walked onto the deck. They looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the giant 16-inch guns looming over them. Surrounding the Missouri were hundreds of other Allied ships. Thousands of planes flew overhead. It was a display of power impossible to imagine in 1941. Japanese officers signed the document with shaking hands. At that moment, it became finally clear the era of samurai was over. The era of engineers, logistics experts, and mass production had arrived. Admiral Yamamoto was right. He woke the giant. And that giant didn't just win the war. He changed the world forever. The lesson of this story is cruel, but important. Never confuse peacefulness with weakness. And never ever start a war with an opponent who can build a new fleet faster than you can reload your gun. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.